So I'm still deciding where exactly I want to be with that. Yeah.
Cool. What are you guys?
I'm Owen. I'm doing an MRes as well in instrument design, working in kind of digital resonant body modeling, and whatever kind of manipulations I can come up with.
Is that with Martin or and Miguel?
Miguel is my supervisor, but I worked with Martin last year to kind of develop the groundwork on what I'm doing for my project.
Yeah, I remember seeing some of your stuff from last year. Yeah.
And there's a bit of weird synchronicity here, because what was one of the many things we talked about last night over the years?
There was quite a few.
Okay, well, he's got one of them on his chest.
Oh yes, I see that. Space Jam.
My father worked a little bit in computer animation,
I
amongst
couldn't see
many other things, and he worked on that film. So
the first one.
Is that the 2, or is that? Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, he worked on that film.
I haven't seen the second one. Not that excited. And
I'm Owen as well. And,
just to confuse things.
undergrad audio engineering.
Cool. Are you in your third year or is it second year?
Well, like, I was doing a degree before this, but then dropped out and now I'm doing so I'm in my first year now.
All right. Okay. Welcome. Cool.
Okay. Are we rolling?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Are we
cool.
rolling now? Okay. So yeah, this is going to be like it's a more intimate, informal session, but also just say hello to our audiences online. If all three of you, or I'm curious how many. If we're Craig, how many do we got on the stream? Okay. I know a lot of people. This is unusual. We've scheduled this at an unusual time, so there'll be a lot of people that are watching the replay. So, but imagine some people will join us online as well. But welcome to the Sonic Lab. Just basic safety announcements, which you probably heard before. In the case of a fire or anything emergency, exits that way, back that way, not that way. Definitely not that way. That's where we keep our lions and tigers. But we're going to start with Derek's going to give a sort of a short talk, preamble on the topic that that's mentioned up there, and then we're going to develop that into more of a dialogue and conversation, and then we're going to extend that out to more of a wider conversation with the four of you as well. Yeah, I've known of Derek's work for many years now, mostly through some of my existing PhD students and previous PhD students who have taken part in workshops by Derek, a lot of hardware hacking related stuff. I've also been, I think I've read some of your work around media archaeology, and then happily I saw a presentation of yours at NIME recently, the NIME conference, New Interfaces for Musical Expression conference, and just fascinated by Derek's work, and great to see both a kind of very established practicing artist who's also kind of steeped in interesting research, kind of engaged in that NIME community. So I thought it was a very positive thing. I thought, hey, let's bring him to Sark to do a concert, which maybe some of you were at earlier today, yeah, and have a talk. So without further ado, just welcome Derek. I don't know, it feels weird applause, but we might as well, right?
Thank you.
Yes.
Great to be here. I'd like to thank everybody that helped me along the way.
Yeah. Oscar speech.
Thank you, Paul, definitely. So yeah, I'll introduce myself very briefly. I'm going to show the basis of a few threads of my research, and I might go through them a little bit quickly, partly because it's meant to be a bit of a provocation, and if you want to come back and talk about details of any of these things, that I want to make that, I'd like to know what you all want to hear about more than me just kind of going for 45 minutes nonstop, which means that I'll have to skip a lot of slides. I'm the king of too many slides. So my background, I have a very eclectic background. Usually when I sit in a kind of a university context, the first thing I like to tell people is that I failed every math class that I ever took in my life, and I owned a keyboard and a bass and a guitar when I was a teenager, and I never really had the discipline to learn to play them very well. This kind of repetitive gestures, to build sort of virtuosity in the fingers and those sorts of things. Nah, I was doing other stuff. So I did a lot of different things in my 20s at least. I was writing a lot. I got a training in silversmithing, so I was a jeweler for some time. And I think that part of the things from being a jeweler keep with me, especially this kind of attention to detail. It's another kind of physical, virtuosity, is the ability to use your hands to make things. And one of the things that I'd learned as a jeweler was that the trace of the human hand on an object is a sign of value, actually, rather than having kind of plastic things pooped out by a machine or something. To have a trace of human contact on something actually makes it more valuable, even if that trace of a human contact is, I don't know, a scratch or dent or something like that. So last night, Paul and I talked a lot about what kind of opened our eyes in music, and I always talk about this German band called Lundsten and Leo Nilsson, and they played things like jackhammers and trash cans and shopping carts and things. So some people get turned on by Glenn Gould playing the piano, or Eddie Van Halen guitar solo, and that sets them on a track. And these weird German drug addicts banging on junk set me on this track. But what it opened up for me was that music is this very, if you could draw these kind of diagrams, these Venn diagrams, it's a slide I don't have, you would have kind of sound as the totality of everything that we're aware of in this acoustic horizon. And sometimes we even have tools to bring sounds that are outside of that acoustic horizon in. For example, a contact microphone to listen to what kind of vibrations exist inside of a table, or a hydrophone that goes under the water or something like that. This is kind of our acoustic horizon. And inside of that, there's a couple of areas that we, as humans, prioritize. One of them being speech, of course, because we're very keyed into the human voice, and the other, of course, being music. Both of these are very codified languages that use symbols to very effectively communicate meaning, and we have established sets of symbols that let us communicate in that. And then there's this kind of overlapping thing that makes it a Venn diagram where speech and music come together, and you use both sets of symbols at the same time to express a new kind of a meaning. So I was always interested in the stuff that was outside of those two interlocking circles in the middle. I was interested in the things that kind of fit in between the piano keys, or things that you couldn't really describe with notes. As I started to read things about like electroacoustic composition and music concrete and things, I realized that people had been developing formal languages to talk about sounds that aren't tonal, at least for a lot of the 20th century. And then I kind of found a place to work. So my interests in sounds tend to be things that have texture and timbre and duration, rather than notes and melodies and tempos and things. So that's a little bit where I come from. I built up a practice building my own both digital and analog electronic sound and image instruments over the past couple of decades. And quite recently, and I've been teaching also, invited guest lecture to lots of places. And more recently, I've decided to kind of get my academic credentials up to snuff, so that I might actually be able to get a permanent teaching position someday, somewhere. So I'm currently doing a PhD at the Royal Technical Institute, KTH, in Stockholm, in media and interaction design, specifically around areas of creative media technologies. And this will be kind of a slice through some of that research. This is a kind of a photograph of a reenactment. The black and white gentleman is a Finnish guy named Erkki Kurenniemi, and he was active as an instrument designer from the 1960s up to about the 80s. He had a company called Degelius, and I think every one of the synthesizers he ever designed, they made one of, or maybe two of. So it was commercially, it didn't really go very far. But there's kind of a cult around his instruments because they were very idiosyncratic, and in particular his instruments explored a lot of ideas of what digital and what a computer meant in the late 1960s. It means something very different in that context than it means to us now. So this is one of his instruments, the DIMI, digital interface musical something. I don't remember what DIMI stands for. I should have made that in my notes. But anyway, this instrument is played with these two kind of probes, and you kind of program it as it's going through these cycles with different sorts of steps. Very cumbersome instrument to play, but it's very interesting in the sense that he was looking at ways of storing and replaying sequences before there were commercial sequencers available on the market. But the gist of that picture is that I think that by going back and looking at things, especially from this very special era of the 1960s and the 1970s, you start to learn a lot more about the kinds of, the kinds of utopias that they wanted out of technology then, and some of those utopias are the same things we want now. And then you come back and you think, well, if the utopias are the same, why did this particular piece of technology stop fulfilling that dream, right? Every piece of technology is made either because we want something or we're afraid of something. And I think technology of the Cold War embodies both of those things really well. Defense technology, for example, which is a whole lecture I could give just on its own of technology based on fear. This is one object that I like to show and talk about at length sometimes when I talk about media archaeology. This is Grindel Matthews' light beam piano. In the 1920s, they were working a lot with a technology to produce sound, which was very linked to the emerging film industry. If you've ever looked at a piece of motion picture film and you've seen this optical soundtrack encoded on the side of it, what you realize is that sound can be encoded in patterns of light. So a lot of people, when they started seeing film produced this way, said, well, if you can record a voice or you can record music onto a piece of film and play it back with light, can't we also synthesize sounds by modulating light? So there was a lot of organs, especially in the 20s and the 30s, built around that technology. This thing as a technological object is, it's every kind of utopia that isn't a utopia now. It's big, it's heavy, it's hot. The artist has taken great pains to show you, and by the way, this is an artistic interpretation. The real instrument didn't look anything like that. It's very futuristic. It's got these kind of laser beams shooting through these spinning discs. And if you look in the corner of the picture, the artist took really a lot of pains to show you something really special. You see which part I mean? Yeah, they really wanted you to know that this thing, you plug it into the wall. It runs on juice. It's electrified, right? This is everything that we don't want. We don't want something that we have to keep plugged into the wall. We don't want something that's too big to put in our pocket, that's heavy, that's hot, that's all kinds of things like that. So this as a utopia is a little bit of a past utopia, but this is what people were kind of dreaming about. And so we can only ever look at the future of music instruments through the lens of the present, and we can only ever really look at the past of music instruments through the lens of the present as well. To us, this thing looks very anachronistic. To an audience in 1926, this was like the dream. This sold magazines and got people to invest in companies and things like that. This picture is a slightly different thing. This is kind of media archaeology of design fiction. The idea behind design fiction is that you make things that don't necessarily have to function. You make things that are speculative and you describe them in different ways. For example, instead of producing a synthesizer, maybe you produce the user's manual for a synthesizer that doesn't exist. And you describe what kind of functions it does, and you describe what sorts of outputs you get and things like that. Or maybe you make an IKEA catalog of different sorts of things. There was a great design fiction that was a travel guide, and it was a travel guide to the city of Rotterdam, except it's Notre Dame, and it's in the year 2050, and the world has been flooded, and Notre Dame is this center of renewable resources. So everything that happens in Notre Dame is carbon neutral and eco-friendly and all these sorts of things. And it's a travel guide where you would go through the city. So you can use these kinds of media constructions to propose different sorts of futures. So this is one of the Star Trek communicators from one of actually the first episode that they filmed of Star Trek in 1965. And this was just using literally like garbage that you would sweep up off the floor of any contemporary electronics studio. There's some like little transistors in there and these little light bulbs and pieces of mechanical switches and stuff, and they cast it in resin and they made this kind of futuristic looking thing. So there's a series of instruments that are the core of my research in Sweden. The project that I've taken on to do there is about historically informed sound synthesis. And so the kind of body of material that I research are mainly a collection of instruments that's held by the Performing Arts Museum, the Swedish Performing Arts Museum. And these are instruments that have been donated by composers over the years. They don't only have electronic music instruments. If you've ever wanted to see a room full of harpsichords or a room full of stand-up basses from, like 500 years of music history or something like that. And it's all in this kind of climate-controlled, Raiders of the Lost Ark, this last scene where they're kind of wheeling the Ark down this like corridor of endless, identical crates, and they kind of stick it anonymously with all the other. This is what this place is like. It's an archival place. It's not really open to the public, and it's meant to just keep things in museum condition. So sometimes it's a bit challenging to get them to let me play with them, but they've been open to it so far. So there's a series of instruments that I'm supposed to examine. They've all either were designed and built in Sweden, or they were used pretty much only by Swedish composers. So there's a real connection to the local specific thing that's going on there. This is one of them. I'll come back to these in a minute. These are, they're called Ljuddar. They were made in the 1968, I believe. And they're just these weird little things that you would make exactly in one of my, hardware hacking, I called them Neanderthal electronics, these kind of simple electronic circuits that you can quickly build and make sound with. And I'll get back into these in a minute, but they're quite nice. And also for 1968, they're kind of junky, but still very sci-fi looking at the same time. The phases of the project are to kind of look at these instruments, kind of pick them apart, do an analysis not only of how they function, but why they were made, which I think is really important to kind of analyze the affordances, like the things that the instrument provides you, and also the ethics, why it was made, to what ends it was made, how it relates to, let's say, institutional structures, what sorts of structures actually gave rise to these instruments and things. Then we'll be making different sorts of digital reenactments of them, maybe making different sorts of interfaces, and eventually working with composers to compose new works using these new digital reenactments. This is one of the instruments, the Dataton. I'll go a little faster now, but if you want to come back to some of these. It's this kind of Lego brick synthesizer that you kind of lock together. It has connectors on all four sides of the modules, and you kind of lay it out on the table. Do we want to listen to sounds? Okay, yeah. I'll blast some sounds really fast for each one of these. So that was a small piece that was made by some workshop students that I had working with these instruments, working with the synthesizers themselves and also processing external signals like their voice through them. Works really well for that. You get really chaotic, crazy stuff. Here are the Ljuddar in action. The idea behind this project was that they built a dozen of these or so, and they did these two gentlemen in the back are Leo Nilsson and Lundsten. And they toured around to different schools in Sweden in 1968 and 1969 and gave these skronky, weird circuit-bent tubes to the children. They projected a film that had lots of very saturated colors in it, and all these tubes, these Ljuddar instruments, were kind of color-coded. So when the kid had it in his hands, and he knew that he was red, and she knew that she was blue, and they saw their color on the screen, then they cranked them up and went for it. So this is only one of them. Just imagine what 12 of these sounds like at once. Ralph wrote an anecdote about these, and Leo told me with that anecdote and another one, which were really good. One was that especially in the north of Sweden, there's some very religious communities, and they're actually forbidden to play music. So they tried to put these instruments in the hands of the kids, and they They just kind of held them, nothing happened. But Leo told me that they also took it to a school that was mostly Sami, like indigenous people of the kind of Arctic region. And he said that the first thing they wanted to do was take them outside and run around in the trees and make bird noises and communicate to each other in the nature with them. So it presented different sets of possibilities to different people, which is what the kind of the definition of an affordance. An affordance is a kind of an interaction between the possibilities that an object has and the user. And this is the Andromatic. This is another one of Erkki Kurenniemi's instruments, and that is the beautiful Ralph Lundsten. He was very much a child or a character of the 60s and was very associated in the Swedish mind with sex and drugs, basically. And this is the sequencer. This is the first instrument that Kurenniemi made for Ralph Lundsten and Leo Nilsson. They had a studio together called Andromeda. Leo eventually left Andromeda Studio, and Ralph continued with it into the 90s and the 2000s. Ralph was the biggest patron of Kurenniemi and commissioned quite a few instruments. I think that Ralph didn't quite know what he was going to get when he ordered something from Kurenniemi, and then he would get these crazy things like the first sequencer, the first kind of digital sequencer, or something that used a camera to track motion and make sound out of it. And this is like in the 1970s, so very, very wild, very forward sort of stuff. We'll listen to a piece of one of Ralph Lundsten's. And finally, this is one that I just found, or was shown to me a few weeks ago, actually, the Musse, which was a project that was done at the Speech, Music, and Hearing Lab at the school where I'm at, by a gentleman named Björn Sandlund. And this is a very early voice synthesizer. I mean, we've had voice synthesizers since the 1920s. If you think about what is the voder and the vocoder and these kinds of things. This one is it's a very smooth sounding one, as you'll hear from the audio sample. It doesn't have this kind of choppy, stuttery sort of thing that a lot of the other glottally kind of oriented speech synthesizers have. But this synthesizer also didn't do consonant sounds, fricatives, or any of the other things. It just did vowels. So it was a kind of very much a singing synthesizer, actually. And it worked with 5 very precise formats that you could set the frequency and the bandwidth of. We'll listen to a piece by John Appleton, who was the director of the EMS, the Electronic Music Studio in Stockholm during the 1970s, I believe. Yeah, he was just a couple of years in the 1970s. So John Appleton worked a lot with the early synclavier as well. And here's the voice. So just in workshops, we have done things like use these instruments to make small compositions like the ones you heard, or also use them as kind of provocations to imagine futuristic instruments with using audio to control the levels. And if you turn all the levels of all 3 channels up, then you get white, of course. So this is a little bit this project that I call Vector Synthesis is kind of a walk through the history of computer animation. And so I'd like to show a few people. I mentioned these names earlier as well. People like John Whitney or Larry Cuba, who was a very talented animator for his own works, but is most well known for the trench animation from the first Star Wars scene. And there's a nice clip on YouTube where you can watch a film of him talking about how they made it. Or a particular hero of mine, Manfred Moore, Manfred Moore worked with these kind of cubic shapes, mostly in graphic presentations, so in plotter drawings or in paintings that he made, all based on algorithmically generated breakdowns of cubes. And he started working with hyperdimensional cubes, so he would trace a line through, let's say, an 8-dimensional cube, and you would get this kind of mathematically generated shape. In 1973 and 4, he made a film called Cubic Limit. It was the only film he ever made, and he worked a lot with these kind of repetitions and breakdowns of these cubes. So you saw a lot of these cubes if you watched the performance this afternoon. And all of these people, Moore, Cuba, and Whitney, and many other computer animators from that time, all had basically the same thing to say about their experience with it. If you make a computer animation in 1973, you show a picture to the camera. Camera takes one shot on film, then the camera renders another frame, and another frame is shot on the camera, and so on and so on. And so you don't actually get to see what you've made till the next day, and there's no real-time interaction with it whatsoever. So all of these animators said things like it was painful, tedious, agonizing, all these sorts of things. So when video technology started emerging in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, people really flocked to it because you had the opportunity to create things in real time, and that would be artists like Woody Vasulka, who would take the raster that makes up a normal television image, like you have horizontal lines and then a vertical frame, or vertical, you know, you'll see some images of what the raster looks like, but you draw lots of horizontal lines going down the screen, basically. And he would use different audio signals to warp that into something like this shape here. Instruments like the Scanimate, which was used, if you've ever seen logos, kind of spinning around and zooming and morphing into things and stuff. And it was probably, if it was done in the 80s, it was done like in the 70s and the 80s, it was probably done on a Scanimate. It's a giant machine that had a team of usually 5 people, including a salesperson, to talk to the client and figure out what they wanted. Or the Rodetra, which was a kind of a scaled down version of the Scanimate, and was used by a lot of artists because it was considered cheaper. And also it was really designed for one person to sit down and just turn knobs and find crazy sorts of stuff. And this is the instrument that Vasulka used. Again, the cathode ray tube and the laser function in a very similar sort of way. You have a deflection that moves things up and down, and a deflection that moves things from side to side, and another signal that controls the intensity of the light. It's a single point of light that's moving around. The whole image is never really there. It only exists in your mind. If you draw pictures with vectors, then you're drawing from one point to another point to another point to another point. If you're drawing things with a raster, then the movement of the beam is fixed, and the beam just turns on and off to illuminate different parts of the screen. If you're working with vectors, then you can make these things called Lissajous figures. A Lissajous figure basically tells you about the harmonic relationship between two signals. So for example, if it's unity, if the signals are, well, in this case, if they're sine waves, then what you get is a circle. Or if they're exactly in phase, then you get a diagonal line. That's what happens mostly when you try to play a sound file from, I don't know, Justin Bieber or something into an oscilloscope, is you get mostly a diagonal line because it's mostly panned center and then some little squiggly things that happen off to the side, but you don't really get a fixed figure. So different mathematical relationships of the one frequency to the other produce different figures. There's your raster, kind of zigzags across, and then it jumps back up into the top, and it zigzags down again. And every place where it needs to return from one side of the screen to the other, it's blanked out so that you only get the horizontal lines and not the zig parts of the zigzag. Generally, if you were working with the Scanimate or the Rodetra or another one of these video processing things, it was actually remarkably similar to making computer animations, except it was happening in real time. But you needed to film the screen with another camera, because what you had on the video screen that you were working with was no longer a valid video signal, because you'd used other signals to twist it around and warp it up. So you actually needed to film the monitor again in order to get an image that you could use for broadcasting, for example. This is a process called rescanning. And people that were watching the stream of the laser performance were watching a rescan of the laser on the wall. And the camera always changes things. It leaves out parts of images. Your eye sees it very differently than the camera does. All these kind of warping effects you can do with the scan processing and things. And this is the implementation that I have made in a language called Pure Data. Some of you have probably worked with this. That's a whole library of stuff that you can use to create vector drawings, like these lissajous figures and the cubes that you saw if you were here for the performance, and also to do scan processing, where you can put a video, like digital video into it, or you can put an image, like a still image or a camera or something, camera input into it, and get information out that then you can apply to a raster that you're producing. And then you can, as you see in the bottom left there, you can deform that raster so you can kind of warp it around and things like that. There was a bit of this scan processing in the second part of the laser performance, where I was making a spiral and then knocking out the brightness of that spiral with cubes, and you would see black parts, or inverting it so that the laser was only illuminated when it was crossing over where a cube was in the video image. And that's all the slides.
Great.
I wanted to get through those. Thank you for your kind attention. And
Yeah.
I think from here, yeah, it would be nice to know what, well, first of all, what you feel like tunneling into, because there's a lot of stuff there, and we could go kind of more conceptual or more technical.
Yeah, there's so much here, although with such a small audience, I actually...
I think if you all want to scream something out, just please.
I have quite a few things that I'd love to kind of develop further and go into, but I'm really curious with this small audience if there's particular things that jumped out at you that you would like to delve into in more detail.
So for the performance, were you just using one laser?
Yeah, that was a single laser.
It's mounted up there.
It's not there anymore.
It's not there. Took it down. But yeah, I can't see from the light.
Yeah, and with the laser, in terms of bandwidth, an oscilloscope can show you a very complicated figure, because an oscilloscope, I mean, modern oscilloscopes are meant to analyze electronics that have clocks in the gigahertz range, right? So they can reproduce a signal that's very fast. Old analog oscilloscopes from, let's say, the 1960s and the 80s, 70s and 80s and things like that, generally were in megahertz. You could get like a 1 megahertz or a 5 megahertz or a 10 or a 20 or 100 or something like that. And that's enough, well, at least from a 10 megahertz up, I think, that's enough to display a video signal on it as a, as a video signal, actually, as the scan lines of the video signal. So you can reproduce a very fast electronic signal with a cathode ray tube, because there's no physical resistance to the beam. The beam just simply gets moved by an electromagnetic field, and that's really fast. The electromagnetic field is produced by coils, so the coils are the only limitation to how fast you can move this beam around. With the laser, it's mirrors, and they have mass, they have inertia, and they have resonant frequencies, which can cause them to break. They have limits to how far they can go, how fast, and all sorts of things. So the bandwidth is really limited. So the figures you could draw with the laser are necessarily a lot simpler. And also because of inertia, to go over here and then quickly go down here, you tend to get these little ripples. So if I program a cube, then I program a bunch of points in the corners to make the laser actually stop there for a while before it takes off again. All of that means that you can't draw all that stuff, super fast. There's a flicker threshold of 25 hertz. Everything below that, you start to see flickering, and when it gets really slow, then you're actually aware of the beam moving around. So that's the lower limit. And the upper limit is how fast you can push these mirrors around. If you have more lasers, of course, then you can overlay images, you can do different sorts of things. There's a German performer named Robert Henke. He was very involved in the development of Ableton Live, and he performed under the name Monolake for a long time. And he has a beautiful laser performance where he uses between, 1 and 4 laser projectors to cover a really large area with lots of imagery. So.
Yeah. Maybe I'll jump in here, and we can alternate back and forth. But one of the things that I'm very interested in your research that we kind of just touched on briefly here, but it's also in the title, so I thought we maybe tease it out a bit more, is media archaeology. Can you give us a bit more information about this as a methodology more generally, and then also more specifically how you've applied it in your work?
Yeah. Media archaeology is this this process of going back and looking at media artifacts from the past. And generally, they tend to be obscure ones. They tend to be things that are no longer current, or maybe even that they were commercial dead ends or something. Things that went for a while and then kind of disappeared from our, from the media sphere, let's say. And so when you go back and you kind of excavate these things, you're looking at them as something that talks about, again, these kind of dreams and fears of the era that they were produced in. So you can use an object as a lens to look at broader kind of social conditions, or let's say you could use an object as a lens to look at the kind of institutional structures that created that object. I mean, no object comes into existence without the motives of both single individual people who might design parts of that object and structures that support those people in order to actually produce that thing.
This is what you meant by ethics.
Yeah, and that's the ethics of it. What structures is it related to? What ends were it created for? Some things are produced with a certain end and become diverted to completely different ends. This is the process of circuit bending that gets talked about a lot in the field of media archaeology, where you take something that was intended for one purpose and you subvert it into something else. The oscilloscopes that I use is a really good example. Probably they weren't designed to show, funny, arty pictures or something like that. They were designed as scientific, instruments, still an instrument, but a scientific instrument. An instrument of inquiry, an instrument of diagnostics, things like this. And so I'm kind of subverting it to do something else with it. And even a more sub kind of category is that there's specific game computers that I use as well. Vectrex, for example, from 1980 to 83 about is when they made them. And they were like a home arcade game. They were kind of blown out of the water when the Ataris came out, of course, so they disappeared from the market. But they were unique in that they used also a vector system. They didn't use pixels. They didn't kind of generate a video signal that you see. They would move the beam around and draw these kind of wireframe things. If you ever saw the video games Battlezone or the original Star Wars video game, I believe that Asteroids is done the same way. You have these kind of, vector-based, point plotted out things, asteroids and little triangles floating around, or kind of polyhedral tanks shooting conical bullets and things like that. So it's very simple graphics, actually. And that's another one that I use. But of course, to the horror of the retro gamer people, I disconnect the game computer immediately and I start sending audio signals from PD into it. So. And again, that's this kind of technical process of getting your hands inside of something, but this kind of more conceptual process of thinking about why it was made, and a lot of it is very speculative. You can take an object that is no longer current, and you can say, well, what if, What if this optical synthesis technology, what if this took off? What if this became the basis of how the Moog synthesizer was designed? The Moog synthesizer was designed around transistors, vacuum tubes, and then transistors. Well, vacuum tubes were going out at the time that the Moog was coming in. So it was designed around the new possibilities of transistors at the time, mostly germanium ones, I believe. But if this had been the current technology of spinning a wheel and shooting light through it, the Moog might have become a very different sort of instrument.
Yeah, there's a lesson for designers here as well as musicians, in that a lot of the things that we intend when we design an object or an instrument is rarely how they end up being used. So just as the examples you gave, you could say the same thing for instruments like the saxophone. The designer of the Duffy sax definitely didn't foresee John Coltrane, and the use of multiphonics and all that.
Saxophone was a military instrument.
Yeah,
it was meant to be able to be heard over crowds of people like a trumpet as well.
So we get that happening across lots of different domains of music-making practices. And this has kind of inspired me to think about musicians not really as users of technology, but more likely abusers of technology, or people that bend and break things. And you could hear that as well in, I don't know, like Ralph Lundsten, that composition was from 1970, I think it was, that you played a clip from. Definitely kind of sounds like chiptune music, the first section of it. And already that's example of this kind of reappropriation of technology similar to your sort of game consoles. But I like this kind of reaching into the past and trying to understand the ethics, both of the institutions and the designers, but also the kind of musicians and the artists that use this work from a particular time period. But I also like how you and some of your work link that then into design fiction exercises. So there's this imagining the future, like what can we do even if we haven't built it yet? Let's strip away the technology for a moment and just think about, okay, like write a user manual for something that doesn't yet exist. What for you is that sort of interplay between kind of the past, drawing into the past in this kind of media archaeological approach, and the kind of use of design fictions? And how do you put those together in your work?
There's a great film about women electronic composers that I recommend everybody to see called Sisters with Transistors.
Yeah.
And Laurie Spiegel has a nice kind of sound bite in it where she's talking about how you know, as a woman making music in the 1960s, it was difficult. And one of the things that the electronic studio allowed women in particular was to not have to be kind of, you know, not have to go through anybody in order to produce music, right? You didn't need to hire musicians to realize a score. You didn't need a venue in order to perform it necessarily. You could just go and you had some tools, and those tools allowed you by yourself to make what you heard in your head and get it out. So she equates this idea of using technology with this kind of freedom. And for her, it's a sense of this feminist freedom from not having to ask other people, especially men, for permission to do things, or having to, she says men, but she talks more largely about power structures. It's about a relationship to be outside of a power structure. And there's a lot of power structures that you interface with. You interface with the power structures of a university. I mean, that's what we're interfacing with right now. I had to interface with the power structures of 3 governments to get from, you know, Stockholm to here. I had to interface with the power structures of the security at the airports. You know, all sorts of things like that. But in using technology, you're interfacing with power structures that were created by other people. The power structure created by Apple, for example, and the power structures they relate to as well. And so you're always engaging with these things. And to produce an object is always to interface with some sort of power structure, unless, and there's people that have, you know, talked about this. Well, okay, I'm going to build a toaster. Well, how are you going to build the toaster? You need this. Well, I'm going to dig up my own aluminum and smelt it and make the casing, and I'm going to, you know, there was one artist that went through all the industrial processes of how to make a toaster, just to kind of engage with those processes and understand how they work. But most of us don't. If we work with electronics, I mean, I spent a long time etching circuit boards and drilling them and things like that, but what do we do now? We send them to China, of course. To buy any of the components to make any sort of electronic instrument, you're pretty much talking to China at some point. Even if you buy them, you know, within Great Britain or within the EU or something like that, they've all been made abroad someplace else. And generally, any sort of electronic gadgetry, musicians are like the last people they would consult about, you know, what needs to happen with these things. We tend to appropriate things from different fields, and in the field of technology, that's no different. The Moog synthesizer and the Buchla and the Surge, all built on instruments that already existed, which were analog computers, right? And analog computers were originally designed to calculate ballistics trajectories of projectiles, basically, missiles and things like that. That was one of the main things that you used with that. So, engaging with power structures. One thing that design fiction allows you to do is to speculate outside of those power structures, because you don't have to produce a working prototype at that point. You can imagine what it is, and you can use it to talk about things. You could use it to talk about, for example, what sort of power structures you might need to interface with in order to produce that thing. One of the design fictions from the, from this workshop, this one up here in the right corner called the Velvet Pancake. The drawing is really hard to kind of make something out, but the workshop participant, and tell me if this sounds familiar in any sort of way to any of you. It might to you, actually.
I was at your previous talk where you talked about this.
Yeah. Is that he wanted this kind of pancakey floppy disk thing that you could kind of stick a chip inside of, and it would kind of enable it to read your mind and produce sounds out of your mind. It's very futuristic. It has a, whatever it was, like a 10G connection in it or something like that. But also that you could tear off a piece of this floppy, spongy disk thing and give it to a friend, and they can take it home and they can grow their own floppy, disky synthesizer thing. Does that sound like anything that you've encountered in your lives?
Think outside of electronics. No?
Are any of you kombucha drinkers? There's this whole culture of kombucha where you make this this thing, this SCOBY, and you kind of give a piece of it. So he was thinking about that, and actually it took me a while to realize it when he was in the workshop. So, so some of the things are very far. I mean, some of the things are technically unrealizable, which also makes them quite interesting. But they had some kind of commonalities. People wanted things that were accessible, that allowed collaboration, had immediate results, had physical control of things, and then more kind of far future things. Some artificial intelligence and biotechnology kinds of things came into it, augmented reality. Some of them were more about biometrics. For example, this bonk. They imagined that maybe it would know which finger was touching it, and it would do different things depending on that. But so this mental interface, this kind of telepathy of the object to understand what it is you're thinking about. Some of those things exist. This idea that the object understands your thoughts and can create art based on that is a very old utopia. If you've ever looked at the work of Daphne Oram, who was a British. She designed a synthesizer, an optical synthesizer called the Oramx, and she wrote a book about that whole process of making her own music studio. She was the first woman to actually have her own sound design studio in the early 1960s in the UK. But she talked about it in that term as well. She said that she didn't want to have to translate her thoughts about sound into symbols that she would write on paper, and then somebody else would read that symbol, and they would translate it into actions, and those actions would be translated. It's too many layers. It's too many steps along the way. She wanted something that was very immediate. She found that by painting and drawing sound on strips of film or panes of glass, and then optically scanning them, that gave her more of this immediacy that she was interested in. And this was a dream for her, and she then found Graham Wrench was his name. He'd been a radar technician for the Royal Air Force, and so he understood things about how to about electronics basically. And he programmed a CRT inside of a light closed box with made a scan line. If you ever played around with old televisions as a kid. Do people still have televisions around? You could kind of dial in the controls and collapse the image into a horizontal line. And if you kind of got the sync of the television a little bit off, that horizontal line would roll. And it would do basically what a computer scanner does now, right? It kind of moves along this kind of beam of light. So Oram had this box with this kind of oscillating horizontal beam of light, and she would put strips of film and panes of glass that she'd painted waveforms on in there. And then the speed of the scanning would give her the waveform out. So this was a dream of her, in some ways a design fiction of hers to start with, until she found somebody with the technical skills to realize it, which is how a lot of you will end up collaborating with artists as well. You'll get somebody that'll come in the room and go, I got this crazy idea. The story of the Brucella synthesizer is exactly that. Morton Subotnick put an ad in the San Francisco Chronicle and said, I want to make the music of the future. I need an engineer to help me make the instruments that make the music of the future. He said, I don't know, a dozen people showed up. All of them were on drugs. Most of them were too crazy to deal with. And the last one was Don Buchla, who was probably on drugs, but he actually knew what he was talking about. And they made this modular synthesizer thing happen out of that. Yeah. And as instrument designers, that'll happen to you a lot. You'll get ideas which are more or less very technically uninformed, and you'll have to translate these very technically uninformed but very visionary ideas into something that is technically informed and is realizable. Or you can work the other way. I mean, when I worked with the vector synthesis stuff, it was very much, okay, these are the limitations of this particular medium. How can I work within those limitations and make something possible out of those limitations? If you follow the demo scene in computer art, this is all about using crappy old computers with really slow processors and like 64K of memory or something like that, and making whole audiovisual compositions using these things. It's about like really leveraging your skills as a technician to use this object to the furthest extent that it can be used. So these are two kind of parallel ways of working. And one is a bit more like taking a design fiction and making something concrete out of it. And the other one is really about kind of digging into like the thinginess, the materiality of the object and seeing what possibilities that materiality offers you. And in the best case, you get to bring those two things together.
I think they're both really valuable methods, and then when placed together, I think they open up and diffract new possibilities that we might not normally come across. Like this idea of the enabling constraint of something, something that's very simple that can generate really complex and interesting activity. But then also, with media archaeology, it's like, okay, I'm going to really dig deep into the past and draw out some things and see how their meanings shift and change. With design fiction, okay, I'll imagine anything, but then see how that shifts and changes when I make it into material reality, So I really like this kind of changing meaning of computer as well that you highlighted. And I was going to ask you a question about that, but you already kind of followed up a bit of how analog computers shifted into these large mainframe computers, and how now we have computers everywhere and we don't maybe even realize it, and sometimes. But it's the shifting meaning of these materials over time across their different sort of ethical landscapes that I think is really interesting as well. And I think if you're a designer or if you're a musician composing something, anybody working creatively in these spaces, drawing on these kind of methods could be a really useful way of thinking about your work. If you're trying to develop a system, an ecosystem for performance of some sort, I think this is really useful kind of ways of workshopping and thinking through ideas. So it's great to hear some of that. We're about to wrap up here.
Yeah, did you have more questions?
Yeah,
stuff.
We have
stuff
like
that
5 minutes more if there are.
Wow, was that an hour already?
Yeah. we have 5 minutes more if there's other things you want to jump in on or ask or kind of draw out further. It's recorded, but like as you were saying, like because of the relationship between the camera and scan, you'll get some sense. I haven't seen the video yet.
You'll see some lights and colors, but none of the actual effect that happens to the eye can really be captured by the camera. There's, for example, there's one section that some of you might remember where there's this kind of expanding circle, but it's being blacked out by a cube, and that ring of light kind of goes out. But how long did you see that cube staying there for after the light had passed it?
It's actually illuminated, I find, even in the dark. Or it seems slightly illuminated, even though it's not there. Some kind of illusion.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the whole thing is an illusion because the circles and all, everything that was there don't actually all exist at the same time. When the camera captures it, it captures 1/25 of a second, and everything that happens in that 1/25 of a second gets rendered flat. Whereas here, you would be watching every motion of that. I mean, you would need an infinite frame rate to capture it, and then
it's continuous in a sense.
Yeah, it's completely continuous. Yeah.
That's quite beautiful in respect that you can only see it as if you physically be there to see the performance.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, it's similar to the relationship of a live acoustic performance and recording that digitally. There is loss of information, but I don't know. It'd probably be still interesting to look back, knowing that, knowing that there is a limit. That it's different. I mean, any video of a performance is different, I think, but this one really exposes that. I think, there's just things that you won't see that you saw if you were in person. Yeah.
Yeah, I missed the start of the performance earlier, but did you explain what all of the visuals actually correspond to in terms of the sound?
Yeah, basically what was happening was that I had one audio signal moving the beam up and down, one moving it side to side, and another audio signal or series of audio signals that control the intensity of the beam. The intensity of the beam I mapped to amplitude modulation. So if the beam, if the beam was drawing a shape, but part of that shape wasn't illuminated, then the corresponding sound signal would also be, dropped during that. So for example, in the spirals where you had the spinning cube in there that was knocking out the spiral, those waveforms would be knocked out in the audio as well. But to draw that spiral, to draw a circle on an oscilloscope, you need two sine waves, a sine and a cosine. They're 90 degrees out of phase. They're equal frequency, they're equal amplitude, and one moves it up and one moves it side to side, and that gives you a circle. To make a spiral, you simply amplitude modulate that circle so that it gets bigger. And then if it's a sawtooth, then it gets bigger and puff, then it pops back to the middle.
Yeah, maybe you could elaborate on some of those details, like we get this kind of kick drum sound. happening that's in the second piece particularly. And I was like, yes, great, into electronic club thing going here, which you beautifully morphed, you know, but
yeah, that's an artifact of the audio signals that are produced. If you're making a spiral, so the circle has to get bigger and then it has to collapse back to 0 again, then the amplitude modulation rises up and boom, drops down. And anytime you have that sharp discontinuity, especially in a digital signal, right? Pop! You get this hard cut. And if you send that pop through, say, a resonant bandpass filter, that's how human beings have been making kick drum sounds since the Stone Age, right? Well, at least since the 1960s, right?
And
your was it 3 audio signals you used to modulate the laser?
Yeah, the laser has a red diode, a green diode, and a blue diode, and they each produce a beam, and those beams converge inside the projector, so they're mixed together to form a single beam. But you can individually address the brightness of each of those beams.
How many channels of audio were you using?
What actually the amplitude modulation of the sound was simply based on the overall brightness.
Yeah, I just meant in what we were listening to were...
That was a stereo. That was
Just
just
stereo.
stereo.
talk a little bit about how you're using the mid-side technique there, maybe?
Yeah, there's different ways you can mix those signals. The classic way is just to take the up and down and plug that to the left audio channel, and the side to side and plug that to the right, and that's interesting. The next step is you might want to get rid of the parts where the beam is blanked out, for example, like if I draw a circle over here and then I jump over here and draw a circle here. Maybe you don't want to hear the part that you don't see, right? So then you use the brightness of the beam to knock out the signal as it's jumping across, and you only turn the audio back on when you are drawing that figure again. If I have 4 cubes up there, for example, the beam is very quickly drawing one and then jumping over and drawing another, and so on and so on. So it's hopping around. It's actually multiplexing, let's say. So then the last thing is, let's say that you've got a very fast-moving signal up and down, but a very slow-moving signal side to side. If you just plug them left, right, then you've got one sound that's really apparent over here, and maybe even a subsonic sound over there, because that signal is moving very slowly. And it's a little bit less sonically interesting. It's very literal. It's a very one-to-one translation of what the beam is doing. So I thought, well, we don't really have much of a way of differentiating up and down sounds unless you have, speakers under the floor and over the ceiling and things. But we hear very good like this because we have 2 ears and we're designed to listen in this sort of a field anyway. So why not use the horizontal signal to move the vertical signal in the stereo field? And that's a mid-side encoding, the same way you would use a mid-side microphone, right? Is that you use a mid-side microphone, has a diaphragm like this and a diaphragm like this. You get the sound coming in here, and you modulate the phase of it using the diaphragm that's going from side to side. So you influence it when it goes this way, you influence it positively over here and negatively over here, and the sound sounds like no, actually the other way around.
Yeah,
the other way around it. You want this sound, because it's being pushed. This sound would be amplified, and this sound would be diminished over here on this channel. So you invert them.
Yeah.
Wow, mid-side.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. When we were talking about that afterwards, because it did give a sense of spatiality. I mean, you're also playing through multi-channel speakers, and those kind of tones cued in different parts of the environment do create a sense of immersion in space for sure. But I think using that mid-side technique, moving away from slightly more literal interpretation, created a greater sense of space, audio space. I thought I don't know if that was similar from people's experiences. Yeah. Great.
Most people don't have a chance to play in a room like this. If you design something, I don't know, for example, the Beast sound system,
Yeah.
How many channels is that? 100 and...
I'm not sure. Yeah, there's lots of these multi-channel arrays and increasingly so across the world.
Yeah. And then you've made a piece that can be played in, congratulations, one room in the world.
Maybe there or Virginia Tech now.
Yeah.
There's one. But so that's the challenge. Is how do you adapt this kind of work to different spaces? But I thought it worked particularly well in here. So yeah, just join me in thanking Derek, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for coming.
Thunderous applause. We'll just copy paste, layer that. Slightly out of phase. No, great. We're probably going for a pint as well in a bit, and you're welcome to join us.